Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of Sleepless Historian, the channel where history gently tucks you in, then proceeds to whisper unsettling facts about the past until you fall asleep anyway. Before we dive into tonight's exploration of medieval medicine, a world of leeches, prayers, and deeply confused barber-surgeons, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure, no guilt, just mild encouragement and vaguely plague-era hospitality. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a strange comfort to know someone else is wide awake at 2 a.m., possibly because their pillow betrayed them. Now, dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum that sounds like distant monks chanting in Gregorian surround sound. Wrap yourself in a blanket that hopefully hasn't been stuffed with straw or fleas, and let's settle in. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where medicine was less about healing and more about survival, not necessarily from the illness, but from the cure. A time when your diagnosis might depend on how yellow your bile looked, and your treatment involved being gently bled into a bowl by a guy who also trimmed hair on Tuesdays. This isn't about shaming the past. No, the people of the Middle Ages did the best they could with what they had, which, to be fair, was mostly herbs, saints, and increasingly suspicious theories about wind. So let's wander into the smoky, sandalwood-scented halls of medieval healthcare, where hope was eternal, but hygiene was optional. Let's start with the foundation of medieval medicine, a theory so influential it managed to misdiagnose half of Europe for over 1,000 years. Meet the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Four bodily fluids that medieval physicians believed controlled everything about you, from your health and temperament to your dreams, digestion, and mood swings. According to this theory, illness wasn't caused by germs. Those hadn't been invented yet, apparently, but by an imbalance in your humors. Too much blood? You were too cheerful and energetic. Too much black bile? Hello, melancholy and existential dread. Phlegm? You were sluggish. Yellow bile? Angry, possibly homicidal, and probably a minor noble. The cure? Adjust the fluids. You'd be prescribed treatments based on what the local physician, who may or may not have owned books, thought was off-kilter. Maybe you'd be bled a bit to calm your fiery nature, or given a purgative, which is a polite way of saying, we're going to make everything come out of you. One way or another. Physicians would examine your urine by holding it up to the light, sniffing it, and sometimes even tasting it. Yes, tasting it. Because in a world without diagnostics, nothing says qualified healthcare like drinking someone's problems. The whole system was basically astrology for body fluids, deeply confident, oddly poetic, and entirely wrong. And yet it persisted. Monks, doctors, barbers, even educated aristocrats all agreed. If your nose was bleeding, the best remedy was to make it bleed more. The real brilliance of the four humors wasn't its accuracy. It was its flexibility. Any symptom could be spun into a humoral imbalance. You fainted? Too much heat in the blood. You had nightmares? Excessive black bile. You stubbed your toe? Probably wind in the joints. The only thing it couldn't explain was how anyone survived. And yet, many did. Probably despite the medicine, not because of it. So next time you have a minor ailment and reach for an ibuprofen, just pause and whisper, "Thank you, science." And also, thank you for not suggesting I swallow crushed snail shells, soaked in wine. If you had a health issue in medieval Europe, whether it was a headache, a fever, melancholy, too much energy, not enough energy, or just the vague sensation that something in your life wasn't quite right, there was one universal solution. Take some blood out and see what happens. This was called bloodletting, and it was basically the medieval version of tech support. Something's not working, pull the plug and hope it resets. The logic was rooted in the four humors we just discussed. Too much blood? Clearly you were overexcited. Too little? Well, good luck. Blood was the most commonly blamed humor, and draining it was the go-to fix for just about everything short of spontaneous combustion. And sometimes even that. Now, bloodletting wasn't just an occasional dabble. It was a full-blown medical procedure, one that required equipment, skill, in theory, and a strong stomach. Doctors, or barbers, or monks, or occasionally the local butcher, would cut a vein, usually in the arm, and let the blood flow into a bowl. A decorative one, if you were fancy. The amount of blood taken varied. Sometimes a few ounces. Sometimes a few pints. Occasionally enough to make your soul start looking for the exit. And this wasn't a once-in-a-lifetime event. Bloodletting was seasonal. Think of it as a kind of biological spring cleaning, only with more dizziness and the constant risk of death. And speaking of barbers, yes, the guys who gave haircuts, they were often your go-to bloodletting specialists. This was before the medical field got picky about who was allowed to poke holes in people. The barber-surgeon was a delightful medieval combo job. Part stylist, part battlefield medic, part human colander. That red and white barber pole, it actually symbolizes blood and bandages. So next time you pass one, just remember, you're walking by a historical monument to mild blood loss. There were several types of bloodletting. The most dramatic involved slicing open a vein and letting it drain into a bowl while your family watched nervously from the corner, hoping the priest wouldn't need to be called in mid-procedure. But if you weren't up for the full fountain experience, there was always cupping. This involved placing heated glass cups on the skin to create suction, pulling the blood to the surface. Then they'd make small incisions and let the blood flow. It's like being gently mauled by a caffeinated octopus. And of course, we can't forget the leeches. Yes, real leeches. Fat, squishy, aquatic bloodsuckers that doctors lovingly applied to your body like angry little stickers. They were especially popular for delicate areas, like inside the mouth, or, in some cases, the eyeballs. No, you didn't mishear that. Leech. In. The B. I. Now, the logic was always the same. Remove the excess blood and restore balance. Unfortunately, no one seemed to agree on how much blood was too much. Some medieval texts give precise instructions. Drain until the patient is pale, but not purple. Others suggest stopping when the patient faints, which is, admittedly, a very clear signal. If the patient died, it was chalked up to either divine will, demonic interference, or their own fault for being spiritually unbalanced in the first place. Despite all this, bloodletting persisted well into the 19th century. Some people swore by it. Others swore during it. And some didn't get a chance to swear at all because they quietly expired halfway through their second pint. So the next time you get a cold and someone suggests you sweat it out, be thankful they don't mean bleed it out while waving a rusty lancet. And remember, in medieval Europe, getting your hair trimmed could come with a complimentary loss of blood, dignity, and occasionally consciousness. If you were alive in the 14th century, first of all, my condolences. But more importantly, you were living in a time when the most feared visitor wasn't death itself, but the person who tried to prevent it, the plague doctor. You know the look. Long black robes, wide-brimmed hat, leather gloves, and that unforgettable beaked mask, somewhere between a bird of prey and a cursed Venetian party guest. These doctors were the medieval world's version of frontline workers, except they looked like characters rejected from a horror movie for being a bit much. But here's the thing. They weren't just dressing up to scare people. There was actual logic behind the outfit, sort of. Let's start with the beak. That terrifying curved nose wasn't just for fashion. It was a kind of medieval air filter. The doctors believed disease spread through miasma, or bad air. So they stuffed the beak with herbs, flowers, vinegar-soaked sponges, and occasionally pleasant things like camphor or myrrh. The idea was that the good smells would drive out the bad ones, because obviously the plague was just waiting to be outscented. It was the 14th century equivalent of carrying around a scented candle and hoping it could fight airborne death. The rest of the outfit was made of waxed fabric or leather, designed to be protective, essentially a hazmat suit for people who had never heard of bacteria. Gloves, boots, a stick to poke people from a safe distance. Yes, that's real. And a wide hat to signal authority. It was a uniform, a spooky, deeply ineffective uniform. Plague doctors were often hired by towns, not by individual patients, and their main job wasn't to cure people. No, that would have been too ambitious. Their job was to document the dying, keep records, make observations, maybe offer the occasional sage-scented prayer. Imagine being assigned to visit every plague-stricken house, knock politely, and say, "Yes, you're still dying, I'll mark it down." In fairness, some tried to help. They prescribed concoctions, everything from vinegar tonics to herbal poultices to things that sound more like ingredients in a witch's stew. Crushed emerald, powdered toad, or, famously, a mix called Four Thieves vinegar, allegedly invented by actual thieves who robbed plague victims without getting sick. The recipe includes vinegar, wormwood, rosemary, mint, and a dash of probably didn't work. But let's be honest, nothing really worked. The Black Death killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people in Europe. Whole villages vanished. Cities lost half their population in weeks. Doctors died too, though the ones in the masks probably lasted a little longer, at least long enough to update their diaries. And yet, for all their terrifying presence, plague doctors became a kind of grim comfort. Seeing one in town meant the authorities were trying. Someone was keeping count. Someone was still walking the streets, even if they looked like a gothic goose. Today, those beaked masks are Halloween staples and museum curiosities. But back then, they were a symbol of doom, and weirdly, of hope. Because when no one else wanted to be near you, the plague doctor still showed up, breathing through cloves and holding a long stick, but still there. And in a time when most people locked their doors, prayed loudly, or fled to the mountains, that weird bird-faced figure was often the last person you'd see and the first to write down your name. Picture this. You've got a fever, your skin's turning a shade of green usually reserved for swamp creatures, and you've coughed up something that just blinked at you. What do? In a modern world, you'd probably visit a doctor, get a diagnosis, maybe pick up a prescription and some antibiotics. In the Middle Ages, you might instead be advised to travel 40 miles barefoot, pay a monk in pickled onions, and press your lips to a centuries-old fingernail of a saint. Because obviously, that's how you get better. Welcome to the world of holy relics. Objects so allegedly divine, they were believed to cure diseases, banish demons, and occasionally act as spiritual insurance policies. Relics were bits of saints, literally. A bone, a tooth, a strand of hair, a splinter of clothing, or, if you were very lucky, something really specific, like St. Jerome's left kneecap or a jar of Mary Magdalene's tears. Churches collected these items like holy Pokemon. The more relics you had, the more spiritually impressive you were. Also, conveniently, the more pilgrims visited your church and donated. Now, did these relics actually work? Well, that depends on how you define work. They didn't cure disease in any modern, testable sense. But they did give people hope, and in a world without reliable medicine, hope was often the only treatment available. Relics were sometimes carried into battle, paraded through plague-infested towns, or placed on the stomachs of sick children, while monks mumbled in Latin and tried very hard not to sneeze. Some were thought to glow, weep, or move mysteriously, which, in a candlelit crypt full of incense and nerves, probably wasn't hard to imagine. If you couldn't make it to a relic in person, don't worry. There were relic vendors for that. Yes, medieval Europe had something akin to a divine Amazon, with sellers hawking everything from splinters of the true cross to feathers from the Archangel Gabriel's wings. Some monasteries supposedly had so many pieces of the true cross that if you assembled them all, you'd have a holy redwood forest. And don't even ask how many heads of John the Baptist were floating around. At least 4 major cathedrals claimed to have the head. One enterprising church even had his skull as a child. You do the math. Pilgrims would flock to these relics, sometimes crawling on their knees, believing a single touch could cure blindness, plague, infertility, or that mysterious leg twitch that only happened during thunderstorms. They left offerings, coins, trinkets, locks of hair, hoping the saint in question was in a generous mood. But behind the scenes, even the church wasn't totally convinced. There were internal arguments about fake relics, forged documents, and suspiciously fresh ancient bones. Some monks got caught whittling their own relics from old soup bones, tossing them into a shrine and calling them St. Clement's clavicle. Yet the relic trade boomed. Why? Because medieval medicine didn't inspire much confidence, and people were desperate. When leeches, urine tasting, and being lightly toasted over a fire didn't help, turning to divine intervention was less about superstition and more about options. You had none. So why not pray to a shin bone? And sometimes people did recover. Maybe the disease ran its course. Maybe the pilgrimage helped mentally. Or maybe the placebo effect was working overtime, powered by incense and exhaustion. In any case, the relic got credit, the priest got donations, and the sick person? Well, if they didn't get better, at least they were spiritually prepared for whatever came next. Because if there's one thing the medieval world believed with absolute certainty, it was this. Even if the body failed, the soul still had a chance, provided you touched the right holy femur. If you were lucky enough to fall ill in a town with a monastery nearby, congratulations. You had access to the medieval version of healthcare with customer service, the monastic hospital. Now let's be clear. This wasn't a hospital in the modern sense. There were no emergency rooms, no surgical theaters, and certainly no vending machines full of mysterious sandwiches. But it was a place to lie down, be fed warm broth, and quietly hope your soul was more prepared for the afterlife than your body was for recovery. Monastery hospitals were run by monks and nuns who saw caring for the sick as an act of religious devotion. Tending to the ill was considered a form of worship, which is lovely, especially if you weren't too attached to outcomes like surviving. These hospitals focused less on cures and more on comfort. Think of them as holy hospices. You'd be laid in a clean-ish bed by medieval standards, surrounded by icons of saints, crucifixes, and the constant low hum of Latin prayers. If you were contagious, you might get your own space. If not, you were likely tucked into a long hall with rows of beds, some straw stuffed, some wooden planks with aspirations. The most important part of your care plan wasn't a medicine cabinet. It was the chapel. Prayer was prescribed like paracetamol. Psalms were recited. Bells were rung. Sometimes a relic would be brought in for extra healing power, just in case your fever responded better to St. Bartholomew's elbow than herbal tea. As for medicine, the monastic toolkit was imaginative. Remedies often included herbs grown in monastery gardens, lavender for calming nerves, mint for digestion, yarrow for wounds, and wine, so much wine, for just about everything else. The monks didn't always know why it worked. They just knew people felt better after 2 cups. They also kept herbals, detailed books filled with medicinal plants, diagrams of questionable accuracy, and marginal notes like "do not eat this," written with evident hindsight. If your symptoms required physical intervention, say a dislocated shoulder or a festering wound, they might refer you to a barber-surgeon who, as we've established, was more accustomed to removing problems than fixing them. But inside the monastery, you were safe. There was warmth, There was structure. There was bread that hadn't been dropped. And sometimes that was all the body needed. Time, quiet, and broth served by someone who called you my child, even if you were 40 and smelled faintly of goat. Now, these hospitals weren't just for peasants. Nobles, clergy, and even travelers could receive care. Pilgrims, especially, were welcome, often bringing both illness and generous donations. Some monasteries became famous for their hospitality and their miracle recoveries, which were sometimes real and sometimes suspiciously well-timed with the arrival of expensive gifts. Still, there was a sincerity to it all. The monks believed they were doing God's work. They didn't have antibiotics or sterile gauze, but they had routine, which in the medieval world was often more stabilizing than the medicine itself. Patients were expected to follow rules: when to eat, when to pray, when to sleep. No chaos, no shouting, no quack doctors suggesting you try eating a burnt toad wrapped in linen soaked in moonlight. Just peace, porridge, and the occasional visit from Brother Gregory holding a poultice and a hopeful smile. Of course, death still came. Often. But here, it came gently, with candles, with singing, with someone holding your hand instead of charging you for it. In the end, a monastery hospital was less about escaping death and more about meeting it on clean sheets with your soul in order, which, in the medieval world, was often the best deal going. So you've tried the prayers, you've bled into a bowl twice this week, the monks have rubbed your feet with rosemary and chanted psalms, and still, your nose is running, your vision is blurry, and you're fairly certain one of your fingers is turning into something that belongs in a salad. What now? Well, it's time to get a second opinion, medieval style. And that means welcoming back everyone's favorite health consultant, the local astrologer. Yes, in the Middle Ages, medicine and astrology were joined at the hip. Before you were diagnosed, many physicians consulted the stars. Literally. They draw up a full astrological chart, noting the exact position of the planets and constellations at the moment of your birth, or sometimes just when you started sneezing. This was considered cutting-edge science. Want to know if your cough is serious? Let's check if Mars is squaring Saturn. Got a sore back? Jupiter might be sulking. In fairness, it was the best system they had that didn't involve biting a frog and hoping for the best. University-trained physicians, especially those from prestigious schools like Salerno or Montpellier, would often refuse to treat a patient until a favorable planetary alignment occurred. Because nothing helps appendicitis like waiting for Venus to leave Capricorn. But if the stars were feeling ambiguous, you could always turn to magic-based medicine, or what we now call desperation dressed as innovation. Let's talk charms and amulets. These were wildly popular. Tiny pieces of parchment, bits of bone, carved wood, or bundles of herbs wrapped in linen and tied around the neck. Some had Bible verses. Others had nonsense words like abracadabra written in a triangle, shrinking by a letter each line, as if illness could be scared away by bad typography. Then there were magical cures. And by magical we mean deeply suspicious mixtures involving ingredients like powdered unicorn horn, spoiler, probably not real, owl brains, crushed emeralds, or bread soaked in the blood of a virgin, which raised far more questions than it answered. One popular cure for epilepsy involved placing a live toad in a bag and wearing it on your body, preferably while standing near a church. Another involved boiling a hedgehog and inhaling the steam. The logic was usually something along the lines of, it worked once for someone's cousin's uncle, so now it's canon. Witchcraft, of course, loomed large in the public imagination. While most magical cures were tolerated, especially if they involved prayer or relics, anything too effective or done by a woman who lived alone and knew what nettle was could raise eyebrows. And by eyebrows we mean accusations of sorcery, followed by awkward trials and possibly fire. Still, people were inventive. They'd bury herbs under thresholds to ward off illness, hang garlic from rafters to keep out demons and colds, sleep with certain stones to absorb bad humors. Some believed wearing a ring made of tin and engraved with specific Latin phrases could prevent toothaches. Others swore by swallowing gemstones, which, predictably, led to far fewer toothaches and far more funerals. But the real magic? Belief. When everything else failed, the physicians, the prayers, the leeches, people still had faith. In saints, in signs, in potions mixed at midnight. And sometimes, despite it all, they got better. Not because the stars aligned or the hedgehog stew worked, but because humans are resilient, and occasionally the body just recovers. Of course, when it didn't, people blamed the moon, or bad spirits, or a goat that looked at them funny last Tuesday. So if you've ever doubted modern medicine, just remember, you could be consulting the stars while tying a pigeon to your head and still sneezing. Imagine lying on a wooden table, staring up at a smoky ceiling while a man with blood on his apron pulls out a knife the size of a small baguette. You'd like to ask if it's been cleaned, but he's already sharpening it on his boot. Congratulations, you're about to experience surgery medieval style. If you're thinking sterile gloves, anesthesia, and calm conversations about risks and side effects, allow me to gently lower your expectations. Surgery in the Middle Ages was not a refined affair. It was brutal, quick, and loud, and mostly reserved for people who had run out of better options. In fact, surgery was often seen as a last resort, like setting fire to your kitchen because the sink was leaking. Let's start with the surgeons themselves. There were no medical licenses, no standardized training, and very few mirrors, judging by their mustaches. Most weren't even considered proper doctors. There were barber-surgeons, that same cheerful crew who'd trim your beard, lance a boil, and amputate a leg, often in that exact order. These multitasking miracle workers carried toolkits that looked like torture sets, bone saws, cautery irons, curved knives, forceps that resembled medieval salad tongs, and syringes the size of turkey basters. All lovingly stored in leather rolls that were, surprisingly, never washed. Pain relief? Don't be ridiculous. The best you could hope for was a strong drink, a leather strap to bite down on, or a quick prayer that you'd pass out halfway through. Some wealthier patients received herbal sedatives like dwal, a mix of opium, hemlock, henbane, and wine, also known as how to poison someone politely. But mostly it was grit your teeth, grip the table, and hope your surgeon had a steady hand and limited interest in experimentation. Common procedures included amputations, usually for gangrene, infected wounds, or a mysterious medieval category known as bad leg. The goal was speed. Good surgeons could take off a limb in under 2 minutes. Great ones did it in under 1. Not for precision, just to reduce the time you were screaming. Trepanning. This was brain surgery with an auger. They drilled a hole into your skull to release evil spirits, treat head trauma, or just improve your overall vibe. Shockingly, some patients survived. Others became examples. Bladder stone removal, done through the perineum. No, I won't elaborate. Just know that everyone regretted it. Cataract surgery involved jabbing a needle into your eye and pushing the cloudy lens out of the way. The technique was called couching, which sounds comfy until you realize it's short for hope you still have an eyeball after this. Wounds were often cauterized with hot irons, not for sanitary reasons, but to stop the bleeding. The smell? Unpleasant. The sound? Worse. The long-term effects? Well, let's just say scarring was inevitable, and if you walked away with both consciousness and dignity intact, you were considered blessed. Yet for all its horror, medieval surgery wasn't entirely reckless. Some surgeons were shockingly effective, especially in the later Middle Ages. They kept notes, compared outcomes, shared techniques. One French surgeon, Guy de Chauliac, became famous for his surgical texts, which insisted on washing wounds with wine. A revolutionary concept, considering wine was cleaner than most people. And battlefield surgery? surprisingly advanced. Army surgeons developed triage systems, field tools, and practical techniques for treating arrow wounds, broken bones, and sword-related incidents, which were, shall we say, frequent. Still, infection was a constant danger. They didn't know about bacteria, but they did know that some patients got worse after the surgeon's knife. Their solution? More surgery, or prayer, or a relaxing month in a monastery, surrounded by chanting monks and the gentle whisper of pus. So the next time you stub your toe and think, I might need surgery, just be glad you won't be biting on a belt while a man in an apron saws off your foot with a kitchen knife and good intentions. And if you do ever time travel to the 14th century, don't get injured. Just don't. Let's say you weren't nobility. You didn't have a monk on speed prayer. You weren't bleeding from anywhere dramatic enough for a barber-surgeon to care. Maybe you were just sick, tired, poor, losing your grip on reality. Or all three. Where did you go? Answer: the medieval hospital, also known as the last stop before the monasteries stopped trying. These weren't hospitals as we understand them. You weren't admitted by a doctor. You weren't assigned a bed with a nurse named Sandra who called you Han. No, you were lumped into a giant open room with other people society didn't quite know what to do with. The ill, the insane, the crippled, the dying, and occasionally people who just fainted in the wrong part of town. Most hospitals were funded by the church or wealthy patrons looking to score some heavenly reward points. The idea wasn't really to cure anyone, it was to provide charity, food, shelter, spiritual comfort, and maybe a corner to lie down in that wasn't actively full of chickens. The interiors varied. Some were more like almshouses, simple dormitories with straw beds, one pot of stew, and a monk who spent half his time reading psalms and the other half politely ignoring screams. Others were built onto monasteries, offering a slightly more organized experience, complete with spiritual routines and the occasional poultice. If you were poor and sick, you could sometimes stay. If you were poor and not sick, you were expected to leave, ideally before breakfast. Beds were precious, so was porridge. But the most infamous wards were for the mentally ill, often called lunatics, madmen, or, with a flair for drama, the possessed. Their treatment ranged from neglect to sympathetic prayers to occasional bursts of enthusiastic flagellation. After all, if someone was raving or hallucinating, surely it was the devil, and nothing says exorcism like a firm whack with a blessed stick. One of the most notorious medieval institutions was Bethlehem Hospital in London, eventually known as, quote, Bedlam. Founded in the 13th century, it began as a religious priory, then slowly evolved into a hospital for the mentally ill, and later into a tourist attraction. Yes, by the 16th century, people paid to visit Bedlam and watch the patients like they were actors in a very tragic play. Humanity, as always, delivered mixed results. Patients who were merely depressed, epileptic, or senile were housed alongside those suffering from schizophrenia, delusions, or traumatic injuries. Treatments included cold baths for shock therapy, chains and restraints for their own safety, of course, or in some cases simply being locked in a dark room until they either recovered or died quietly. But even in the worst conditions, there were flickers of care. Some monks genuinely tried to comfort the afflicted. There were attempts at classification, not very accurate, but earnest, and now and then a patient recovered, or improved, or at least stopped yelling at statues. Meanwhile, hospitals for the dying were even more stripped down. These weren't places to fight for your life. They were places to make peace with losing it. A priest, a crucifix, a bit of bread, maybe someone to close your eyes at the end. Your name recorded in a book. Your death assigned a small prayer. Privacy? Rare. Dignity? Conditional. But in a world where most people died in fields, huts, or on the back of a donkey mid-pilgrimage, a hospital bed, even a straw one, was better than the cold ground. The hospitals were loud, they were smelly, they were often underfunded and understaffed, but they were also, strangely, human. People tried. Not always kindly, but they tried. So the next time you visit a hospital with sterile walls, beeping monitors, and overworked nurses who still manage to ask how you're feeling, just remember, in the Middle Ages, you'd have been lucky to get a bowl of broth and a monk who didn't smell like beeswax and regret. Imagine you're living in a world where people throw waste into the street, believe bad smells cause disease, and think sneezing too hard might rearrange your soul. Now, in that same world, try not to get sick. That was the challenge in medieval Europe, staying healthy in a place that was actively trying to kill you. Let's begin with the basics. Germs didn't exist. Well, they did, of course, but no one knew it. The average person believed illness came from God, because you sinned. The devil, because someone else sinned. Bad air, because someone forgot to burn rosemary that morning. Or your humor's just doing a dramatic jazz solo in your gut. So how did people try to stay healthy? Well, they had some ideas. Some of them were even accidentally helpful. First, there was cleanliness, which was weirdly both under and overvalued. People washed their hands before meals and sometimes after going to the bathroom, not for hygiene, but because rituals and manners. Bathing, however, was more controversial. Doctors warned that too much bathing opened the pores and let disease in, like your skin was an extremely lazy security guard. Still, public bathhouses did exist, and people loved them, so much so that the church eventually got suspicious because bathhouses became, well, social. By social, we mean naked and flirty. So yes, hygiene was occasionally canceled for being too fun. Then there was diet, which, in theory, could help with health. But unless you were a noble, your diet consisted of pottage, turnips, suspicious bread, and beer. Not exactly a multivitamin. Still, people believed certain foods could cool or heat the body, balancing your humors. Want to avoid a fever? Eat cucumbers. Want to beat the winter chill? Red wine and goat meat. Want to live forever? Sorry, no such recipe, unless you count not being born in 1347. Now let's talk air. Everyone believed air could be poisoned, especially during plagues. So people took serious measures to clean the air. Burned herbs in the streets, carried pomanders, little scented balls of cloves, cinnamon, and dried flowers. Stuffed dried flowers into every pocket, pillow, and, if you were a plague doctor, your terrifying bird mask. One famous belief? That bad smells made you sick, and good smells cured you. This is how you end up with a person vomiting into a bucket, while their family waves lavender under their nose. Oh, and let's not forget quarantine, one of the few medieval ideas that actually worked. When plague broke out, port cities like Venice would isolate ships for 40 days, 40 giorni, and thus the word quarantine was born. It didn't always stop the plague, but it slowed it down just enough to buy time for everyone to panic more gradually. Another prevention method? Warding off evil. This included wearing charms, hanging crosses over doors, chanting prayers at certain times of day, avoiding people who looked like they might be witches, werewolves, or unusually chatty. Sometimes people tied live toads around their necks to absorb disease. Others drank crushed pearls mixed with wine, which probably cured nothing and tasted like medieval regret. The rich avoided the poor. The poor avoided the dying. Everyone avoided the town butcher, who was always a little too enthusiastic about his medicinal sausages. Doctors, when available, wrote long, elegant treatises about prevention, often involving proper balance, clean air, and moderate emotions. Which sounds fine until you remember that the average person lived next to a pig and hadn't had an emotion-free day since their third failed barley harvest. In short, you couldn't really avoid getting sick. The world was full of invisible dangers, and the strategies available were more about feeling proactive than being effective. But still, people tried. They lit incense, ate mint, slept with amulets, trusted the stars, trusted saints, trusted the one guy in town who hadn't died yet, assuming he must be doing something right. So, while we might roll our eyes at their methods, let's give a little credit. They lived in a minefield and still managed to raise children, build cathedrals, and invent cheese. Not bad, considering they thought a sneeze could be fatal and a blessed onion could stop the plague. Let's imagine a common scene in medieval Europe. You wake up with a sore throat, your head aches, your nose is dripping like a leaky candle. Nothing serious. You've caught a cold. Today, you take a day off work, drink something hot, and scroll endlessly through social media while wrapped in a burrito of blankets. But in the Middle Ages? Oh no, you're in danger. Not because of the cold itself, which, despite the grumbling, you'd probably survive, but because someone is about to treat you. And in medieval medicine, treatment was less about gentle recovery and more like a game of, what's the worst that could happen? First, someone, your mother, a monk, or that nosy neighbor with a mysterious collection of frog bones, decides it's serious. It's in the humors, they say. The phlegm is rising. And they're not wrong. You are full of phlegm. Because that's what a cold is. But in the medieval worldview, this signals an imbalance, and that imbalance must be corrected. Option 1. Bloodletting. Because clearly, when you're tired and congested, the answer is to remove a pint of blood. It will rebalance your fluids. It will also make you faint on the floor and possibly catch pneumonia from lying in a damp wool robe for 6 hours. Option 2. A purgative, which means you'll be given something, usually plant-based, occasionally terrifying, to make you vomit, or, if you're especially lucky, to cleanse you from both ends. This isn't a suggestion, this is doctrine. The illness must leave your body, no matter how dramatic the exit. Option 3. A nice hot poultice made of mashed herbs, goat fat, and, well, you probably shouldn't ask. It will be applied to your chest, or your feet, or, for some reason, your armpits. No one explains why. But it's very important you lie still and don't complain about the smell. Option 4. A charm. Maybe someone gives you a dried mole's foot to wear on a string, or draws a protective circle around your bed with chalk and mutters in Latin. This part isn't even the worst. It's oddly comforting if you don't mind waking up with herbs under your pillow and a priest mumbling about evil spirits in your direction. Then comes the diet. You'll be told not to eat heating foods, so no garlic, no pepper, no onions. Bread and water only. Maybe some boiled lettuce if you've been very good. You're also told not to sleep too much, or your body will become sluggish. No sleeping during the day. The humors hate naps. Oh, and don't forget the room has to be aired. So someone opens a window in February and leaves you shivering under 3 furs while they light a fire made of rosemary, sage, and wishful thinking. At this point, the cold, which you could have slept off, has become a full-body ordeal. You're dehydrated, exhausted, mildly poisoned by a syrup of boiled radish and pigeon bile, and you've bled just enough to question your decisions. All because you sneezed. But here's the wild part. People still survived. Not everyone, but a surprising number. The body is stubborn. It keeps working even when the treatments feel like dares. And sometimes, medieval people did accidentally get things right, like fresh air or honey, or staying in bed with a hot drink when it wasn't made of boiled eel. Also, some treatments were actually helpful. Herbs like thyme, mint, or chamomile could ease symptoms. Steam could help a stuffed nose. And rest, even when done out of sheer exhaustion, often worked wonders. But for every gentle tea, there was a leech on your temple. For every soothing bath, a purge that made you see stars. So yes, you might survive a medieval cold, but only if you refused the cure. If you were lucky, you recovered. If not, you became a cautionary tale. One of those, he had the sniffles and then died after drinking vinegar mixed with powdered snake. Stories that haunted village gossip for generations. Still, at least someone learned from it. Probably not the doctor. Before hospitals, before antibiotics, before the humble thermometer beeped its way into our lives, there was only one group you could really trust when things went wrong: the saints. These weren't just any saints. These were specialists, divine beings with resumes tailored to your exact complaint. If you were coughing up something unfortunate, hallucinating frogs, or had a mysterious swelling that matched none of the medieval illustrations, you didn't just pray to God in general. You went directly to the source. Need help with skin disease? Saint Anthony. Bad eye? Saint Lucy. Bubonic plague? Saint Sebastian. Toothache? Saint Apollonia, who according to legend had all her teeth pulled out, which somehow qualified her to handle yours. This wasn't superstition. This was spiritual protocol. Each saint had their own backstory, often tragic, usually gruesome, and somehow always related to their area of expertise. Saint Denis, for instance, was beheaded and supposedly carried his head several miles while preaching the whole way. He became the patron saint of headaches, because of course he did. The logic went like this. If a saint had suffered from or died of something related to your problem, they were uniquely qualified to intervene. It's like divine customer service, except instead of being on hold for 20 minutes, you lit a candle, made an offering, and hoped the celestial queue wasn't too long. Many towns had their favorite saints, with shrines, statues, and occasionally body parts. Yes, the relics again. A toe bone of St. Cosmas, a vial of St. Catherine's blood, a splinter from St. Lawrence's grill. He was roasted alive. Naturally, he handled burns. These relics were visited like clinics. People touched them, prayed to them, and sometimes left behind small models of the afflicted body part. Wooden legs, wax ears, little terracotta livers. A sort of medieval build-a-body. Pilgrimages were often made to places where saints were said to perform miracles. The more popular the saint, the longer the journey. People walked across countries to reach a shrine that might ease their pain, cure their child, or help a loved one survive the fever that had already taken 3 neighbors and a goat. The rituals were elaborate. Pilgrims carried badges with the saint's image. Some shaved their heads. Others walked barefoot, carrying their shoes as offerings. And when they reached the shrine, they waited, prayed, slept under the stars or on straw mats in holy dormitories. Some claimed visions. Others returned unchanged but comforted because they'd tried everything, even the divine. Saints also offered spiritual explanations for disease. If medicine failed, perhaps you'd angered a saint by forgetting a feast day. If you were miraculously healed, you owed them thanks. Maybe a candle, maybe a donation, maybe building a chapel in their name. If you were feeling flush, doctors and saints coexisted awkwardly. Some physicians dismissed miracles, others fully embraced them. There were even treatises on which saint to pray to before surgery, a kind of divine pre-op checklist. And if things went badly, well, perhaps you'd mispronounced the prayer. Or maybe St. Roch was busy. Oh yes, St. Roch, beloved during plague outbreaks. He was said to have survived the plague, healed others, and once hung out with a dog who brought him bread daily. As a result, he became the go-to guy for contagious diseases and dog lovers. In the end, these saints weren't just spiritual symbols, they were hope. In a world where your best options included being bled, burned, or buried under herbs, calling on someone in heaven who specialized in your exact misery felt reassuring. Even if it didn't work, it reminded people they weren't alone. And sometimes, when you're sick and scared, that's the most healing thing of all. In the dusty corners of medieval towns, far from the lofty halls of universities and cloisters of monks, lived the most practical, quietly indispensable, and occasionally suspicious figures of all: village healers. These weren't licensed professionals. They didn't wear robes or read Latin. They didn't consult star charts or carry relics in gold cases. But if you were sick, really sick, with no money, no priest, and no time to walk to a monastery, you went to her, or him. But let's be honest, most were women. Known as wise women, cunning folk, or depending on the decade and the mood, witches. Their toolkits were not shiny. They didn't include bone saws or heated irons. What they had was a deep generational knowledge of herbs, seasons, soil, and symptoms. They knew which plants cured stomachaches and which cured the neighbor's noisy rooster. Permanently. They knew what time of year to harvest willow bark and which leaf helped bring on the bleeding. Translation: a very risky form of medieval birth control. Their medicine was messy. It involved boiling, pounding, drying, steeping, and sometimes burying. Salves were mixed with animal fats. Potions often included urine, ashes, or very specific bugs. If something needed to be drawn out of the body, they had a poultice for that. If you needed to sleep, they had a tea. If you needed to stop sleeping, they had something stronger. Sometimes their cures worked because of real chemistry. Willow bark, for example, contains salicin, nature's aspirin. Juniper is a diuretic. Garlic fights bacteria. And honey? One of the best natural antiseptics we still have. But science wasn't the selling point. Mystery was. These healers operated in a world where medicine and magic were the same spell, just pronounced differently. They whispered blessings over broths, drew circles in ash, sang songs to the moon while stirring thistle into wine. People didn't care what the method was, only that it might work. They also handled the jobs no one else wanted. Midwifery, delivering babies in fire-warmed kitchens, wiping blood with cloths that had seen generations of births. Death watching, sitting with the dying, helping families say goodbye when everyone else had given up. Mental illness, not always cured, but softened with rituals, herbs, and the comfort of someone who didn't immediately reach for shackles. But with all this earthy wisdom came risk. Because when a wise woman cured someone the priest couldn't, people noticed. And when a harvest failed, or a child died, or the cow refused to give milk, people noticed that too. The same hands that mixed lavender and mint for fevers could be blamed for boils and storms. A healer might be revered in one season and reviled the next. She might have 20 clients in 1 week and be accused of witchcraft by Sunday. And heaven help her if she had a black cat. Still, they endured. They passed their knowledge in whispers and kitchen notebooks, written in a blend of symbols, folk rhyme, and "do not let men see this." They brewed cures by candlelight, not for pay, but for potatoes, eggs, and the eternal gratitude of someone whose cough didn't turn into a funeral. Even educated physicians sometimes consulted local healers. They didn't say it out loud, of course, but when the bleeding didn't work and the prayers didn't stick, someone always knew, an old woman near the woods who makes a tea from roots. And off they'd go, pretending it was research. And perhaps that's the best summary of medieval folk medicine. Half science, half superstition, 100% survival strategy. It wasn't always clean. It wasn't always safe. But in a world where the only constant was uncertainty, village healers offered something better than a diagnosis. They offered hope. And sometimes, that was enough. Let's take a moment to celebrate a rare but wonderful medieval outcome. You lived. After all the bloodletting, leeching, chanting, sneezing, praying, vomiting, boiling, and possibly being lightly exercised, Your fever breaks. Your wound closes. Your cough fades into memory. Congratulations. But don't uncork the celebratory wine just yet. Because in the Middle Ages, survival wasn't the end of the journey. It was the start of another, less glamorous process: recovery. In a world with no concept of bed rest as we know it, the post-illness period was a delicate balancing act. You weren't expected to bounce back with the energy of a caffeinated squirrel. Instead, the focus was on gradual rebuilding of strength, spirit, and occasionally dignity. Let's start with the basics: food. You'd spent days, maybe weeks, on a restricted diet of broth, barley water, and the occasional suspicious root. Now that you weren't actively leaking humors, you could slowly reintroduce real food. Emphasis on slowly. Medieval doctors warned against greedy eating during recovery. Apparently, nothing says relapse like celebrating with a roast duck and passing out in the turnip patch. Your caretakers, likely a monk, a family member, or a patient neighbor, would ease you into recovery with soft foods: porridge, eggs, fruit stewed, until it gave up all its hopes and texture. Meat? Only in tiny portions, and only if you were considered of strong constitution. If not, more soup for you. Then came movement. No physical therapy, no yoga mats, no inspirational podcasts. Just someone helping you stand up without falling over. Maybe walk outside, if the weather wasn't trying to kill you. Maybe a quiet sit in the sun, because vitamin D was very much in style, even if no one knew what it was. But more important than food or fresh air was this: your soul had to recover too. Medieval people believed that illness wounded not just the body but the spirit. So recovery often included extra prayers, confessions, and even pilgrimages. Not the long kind, just a local shuffle to a nearby shrine to say thank you to the saint who maybe pulled a few strings on your behalf. It wasn't uncommon for recovering patients to give offerings: coins, candles, or, if they were especially grateful, entire goats, to churches, monasteries, or healers. It was a way to close the loop. You'd asked for help, you'd survived, now you gave thanks, and maybe tried very hard not to sin for a little while. Socially, recovery was also awkward. Your friends and family were thrilled, of course, but also possibly surprised. They might have already said goodbye. They might have divided your sheep. In some cases, they might have remarried your spouse. So now you had to rejoin society, which meant proving you were no longer contagious or possessed or a walking reminder of plague. People were cautious. Some towns had rules about how long you had to stay away. Some insisted on ritual baths. Others were more informal. If your neighbors didn't scream when you waved, you were probably fine. And the body? It remembered. Medieval survivors often lived with lingering effects: limps, coughs, tremors, strange scars, and the kind of fatigue that modern medicine would call chronic, but they just called Tuesday. Still, life resumed. You went back to work, back to farming, back to praying. Maybe you told the story of your illness to anyone who'd listen. Maybe you swore off eels for life. Maybe you kept the charm that saved you tucked under your pillow like a medieval teddy bear. But one thing was certain: you didn't take survival for granted. Not in a world where the wind might carry disease, the water might carry death, and your barber might suggest removing a leg to fix a toothache. You had lived. And that was rare enough to be celebrated, quietly, cautiously, and with just a little wine. So what have we learned? That leeches were plentiful, but logic was not. That physicians consulted the stars, barbers carried saws, and prayer was often more accessible than potions. That colds could be fatal, fevers were feared, and healing, when it came, was celebrated with both gratitude and garlic. In short, medieval medicine was a mess. A hopeful, imaginative, chaotic mess. It was born of limited tools and unlimited creativity. People worked with what they had: herbs, saints, stars, kitchen soot, boiled frogs, and the quiet conviction that somewhere out there was something that could help. And despite the mistakes, the bleeding, the burning, the praying to a jawbone, there was one truth that ran through it all. People cared. They held the hands of the sick. They lit candles. They sat up through the night, mixing poultices and whispering prayers. They built hospitals and herb gardens. They believed in healing, even when they barely understood disease. Sure, they misunderstood nearly everything about the body, but they understood what mattered most, that being ill is scary, that being cared for is comforting, that hope, no matter how strange its form, helps us survive. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think of those medieval villagers lying on straw mats, clutching charms, breathing in rosemary smoke, and believing, truly, that they might get better. Some did, and some left behind recipes, remedies, and rumors that would, over centuries, evolve into the medicine we know today. So next time you reach for aspirin or wrap up in a blanket with a cough, spare a small, amused thought for our ancestors. They did their best, and occasionally they accidentally did something right. Sleep well.